Good evening and welcome back to 31 Horror Nights. It's October 14th and tonight's classic is The Blair Witch Project. This is another movie that I have seen before this. I've talked about this movie on this channel before in the past, but it has been a few years since I've seen this movie, and I've seen a lot of other found footage stuff since then, including some of my new favorites, and I was kind of wondering if this movie would still be as good as I remembered it being when I watched it again this year. As it turns out, this movie is actually a little bit better than I remember it being. The Blair Witch Project gets a 9 out of 10. It still holds up very well and is a very, very good found footage movie. In case you didn't know, the Blair Witch Project story is that there are these 3 film students who are making a documentary about a local legend called the Blair Witch, and they go into the woods and they never come out. And it's framed as this is the footage that was found years later and edited together into a movie. The video quality in this movie is pretty bad, but this was made by a bunch of nobodies in 1999 on almost no money, so I think it at least has more of an excuse than 28 Days Later did in looking that terrible. Part of the reason why the Blair Witch Project still holds up so well is the acting. All 3 of the main actors in this movie, Mike, Heather, and Josh, the names of the actors are all the names of the characters in the movie. They all do a very, very good job, and that's even more impressive considering the fact that almost every single line in this movie is ad-libbed. This movie was filmed without a script. They just told the actors in which direction a scene was going, and they would act it out. You could have fooled me because the acting in this movie comes off as very well done and very natural. They're good in the scenes where everything is laid back, and they're good in the scenes where things get really intense. The acting is 2 huge thumbs up in this movie. I think the main thing that most people are split on when it comes to the Blair Witch Project is the movie's pacing. The movie is very gradual in its build-up. It starts out small, and then it keeps gradually adding more things to it. More intense things keep happening, and pretty much the entire movie is a build-up to the final scene at the very end of the movie. Now, a lot of people interpret that as this movie being very boring because not a lot happens. And to an extent, that's true. But to me, this movie isn't one where nothing happens. I've seen a found footage movie where nothing happens. That was Willow Creek. And this one is about the little things, and the little things keep piling up as the movie continues. And in the movie, you can see what toll that this is all taking on the characters. They start out as completely normal people, but as the movie continues, they keep getting more paranoid, more frightened. They start snapping at each other. Some of them just kind of lose it a little bit. And you see it happening in what feels like real time. I think that this kind of adds to the style because it doesn't really come off as a movie with scenes as much as it is watching the documentation of something that's actually happening. It does something that not a lot of movies even attempt to do, which is try to make it come across as not a movie, but reality. And while it doesn't totally achieve that, it gets really, really close. When it comes to elements of horror, there are actually more scares in this movie than I remember there being from when I watched it a few years ago. One thing that I really liked, was a nice touch, was that they come across this, what was kind of like a burial ground, but instead of tombs, there's little stacks of rocks. And one of the characters accidentally knocks ones over, and they quickly put it back together, and they just leave. And later, when they pitch a tent, and then they fall asleep, and then they wake up the next day, there are 3 piles of rocks pitched around the tent in a circle, and they're all completely certain that they weren't there when they fell asleep. So even if it was somebody else doing it, they would have done it completely silently, in the dark, without being able to see what they were doing, and they managed to do it that well. One thing about this movie that's kind of subtle but really effective is that the sort of change between this is something normal bad that's happening to this is something supernatural bad that's happening is very gradual. I'm kind of hard-pressed to find where the switch happens, if anywhere at all. It starts out with 3 people legitimately just getting lost in the woods, but then it turns into them walking in one direction an entire day and somehow still ending up going in a gigantic circle, coming across the exact same log at the exact same creek that they started out in the morning. I think the Blair Witch Project got so many people's attention because it managed to get across so much while doing so little. This really is one of the most subtle horror movies I've ever seen. It's one of those horror movies where the thing that you're supposed to be afraid of is something that you never actually see, and a lot of things are just left to the viewer's imagination. Sort of like how when the characters see it, it's just left up to their imagination too. Another thing that sort of puts you in the experience with the characters. Yes, the camera quality sucks and the shaky cam is pretty severe, but when you look past that, this is a very, very smartly made movie, and it still holds up very well even 19 years later. If you want to get into found footage but don't really know where to start, this is a pretty logical place to start because in a lot of respects, this is the movie that started it all, the one that all the other found footage movies are getting inspiration from. It's not the first found footage movie ever made, but it is the first one to make such a big impact, and for good reason. This is something I would highly recommend if you're looking for something spooky to watch on Halloween. And with that, let's go into the spoiler section of the video. The biggest turning point in this movie, the part where this sort of turns from we can get out of the woods to we are probably going to die, we are getting hunted, and all we can do is survive, is the point where one of the three campers, Josh, disappears, and the other two, Heather and Mike, have no idea where he went. And something that keeps happening a little bit later on in the movie is that they'll hear his voice calling out to them, but they have no idea where he's coming from. And when they ask for him to give them more information, he never answers them. Now, this can be interpreted a lot of ways. I always just looked at this as this is the Blair Witch killing these kids. But other people have said that this almost sort of implies that Josh was the one that killed the other two because he disappears and it's his voice that leads them into new places and the place where they would eventually die at the end of the movie. I don't know. I still think that's kind of far-fetched, but everybody can have their own opinions. The most famous scene in the Blair Witch Project is towards the very end of the movie where Heather focuses the camera on herself and she apologizes to the families of all three of them because it was her idea to go out in the woods and she was the one who at the beginning insisted that they weren't lost and had a lot of ideas. She was the one in charge for a lot of the movie. And you see her break down into tears, and it's not pretty crying. It's there are tears coming down her face. She's heaving, her nose is running. She really does look like she is just having a mental breakdown and she's freaking out. That is, and still remains, one of the most powerful scenes I've seen in a horror movie. It's the most famous scene in the Blair Witch Project, and for good reason. Now, right after that, Heather and Mike start hearing more sounds that drive them out of the tent, and they find an abandoned-looking house in the woods. And they go in and they hear Josh's voice, and there was a point where the two of them get separated. Mike goes downstairs into the basement, and you see the camera drop to the ground. You have no idea what happens to him. You don't see anything. And then it cuts to Heather's camera. There were two cameras the whole time in this movie. And she goes down to the basement, and when they were interviewing people for this, somebody talked about this child murderer who would bring two kids down to the basement in his house in the woods, and he would make one face the corner, and he would kill the other one, then turn around and turn the kid in the corner around and kill that one. And she walks in and she sees her friend Mike just standing there facing the corner, and she screams and she gets attacked, and that camera falls to the floor, and there's 10 seconds of the camera just on the ground and silent. Now, a lot of people thought that this ending was a huge letdown because you never actually saw anything, but to be honest, I think that this is the best ending we could have realistically hoped for such a good build-up. Most of the movie is the fear of the unknown, and that ending perfectly encompasses that. There are a lot of people who say that this is hands down 100% the best found footage movie ever made. I think it is one of the best I've ever seen, but I know that I think Hell House LLC from last year is better, and I think that Home Movie is better too, but I haven't seen that one in a while either. Still, this is where a lot of this started, and it's a really good movie. If you haven't seen this movie and you want to, it gets full endorsement from me. Check it out. Okay, I'll see y'all tomorrow.